some questions to you, Ori. I want to start with your argument, which is in the title. The subtitle uses the phrase the Long Attica Revolt. So you argue that the Attica Rebellion of September 1971 actually has a much longer genealogy and origins in other prison and jail facilities. So instead of starting your book in September of 1971, you start earlier. And one of the things you point out is that many of the rebels in Attica had been part of rebellions and revolts in other facilities in the prior years. So can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by the Long Attica Revolt and how this reshapes what we typically refer to simply as Attica or the Attica Rebellion?
Sure. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to talk about the book. Let me start by talking a little bit about method, because the concept of the Long Attica Revolt was something that was revealed to me by the people that I was talking to. And so I want to answer that question first by talking a little bit about how I started to write this book and how I started to reach the conclusions that I reached. And so really the book, it's a retelling of, and how many of you have heard of Attica? Raise your hand if you've heard of the Attica Rebellion. So most of you. So most of you have heard the dominant narrative that says that Attica was a 4-day rebellion that erupted on September 9th. It was crushed on September 13th. That the demands of the people who led that revolt were mostly concerned with ameliorating conditions within the prison. And it's not that that narrative is wrong, it's just that it's incomplete. And so part of what I do in the book is I center the analysis of people who understand themselves and who were understood by the state to be revolutionaries. And the conclusion that I reach is that prisons are the way they are in many ways to contain this particular class of politically radical intellectual, to contain them physically and also to contain their ideas, to prevent their ideas from circulating. And so this became the precise category of people who I wanted to listen to and to think with and to try to elaborate their political philosophy in order to think about their strategies, to think about their tactics. And so in New York, as you all know, Attica is a pivotal moment in the history of prisons. And so when I started to talk to sort of elders of the prison movement about Attica, some of them would tell me about rebellions that happened in the Tombs. So then I had to say, well, what's the Tombs? Well, the Tombs is an infamous jail in the New York City jail system. Some of them would talk about Auburn. Some of them would talk about the Vietnam War. Some of them would talk about the Haitian Revolution. And so I had to then rethink what I thought I knew about the sort of development of history and the movement of time, and to think with these folks about a much more distended genealogy of rebellion that traversed multiple carceral sites, and one that asserted demands that were much more capacious than simply about tinkering with prison conditions, even though prison conditions are extremely important. And there are people inside who are struggling to transform prison conditions, and that's important. But there's something about the dominant narrative that has reached us, and it has reached us not by accident. It has reached us as part of a counterinsurgency that's in fact against us, right? That attempts to basically incarcerate the revolutionary politics of the movement and to lead us to believe that these movements are just about prisons when in fact they were about transforming the world. And in fact, prisons are actually responding to this much longer genealogy of Black rebellion, not the other way around. So this is the other problem with the dominant narrative of Attica, which says that it's about these incarcerated and brutalized people who are rebelling against prison conditions, which again is not entirely false, but it's incomplete, and it's incomplete in really politically significant ways. In fact, what I show in my book is that prisons were used as a strategy to interrupt the development of Black revolutionary consciousness outside the walls, right? And so prisons were an attempt to incarcerate Black radicalism, and in fact that attempt failed, it backfired, and you see this proliferation of prison rebellions. And so then the prisons had to change and reform and modify and reconstitute themselves in order to more fully prevent these ways of thinking and knowing and theorizing from circulating. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to really to decarcerate this criminalized tradition of Black radicalism and to narrate it on its own terms, right? So that's what I can say about the Long Attica Revolt. And so that's the first half of the book. The first half of the book is really about trying to elaborate this tradition, to show it in all of its complexity and all of its multiple layers. You know, armed struggle, writing, theorizing, intimate care work, internationalism, all of these different dimensions, self-consciously engaging in narrative warfare, understanding of the way the state tries to reframe narratives, and then consciously engaging in counter-narrations, counter-propaganda as a way to try to politicize movements on the outside. And then the second half of the book is called Prison Pacification. And this is really about the ways in which sort of what I would call a carceral warfare state responded to this proliferation of Black radicalism, essentially through techniques of counterinsurgency that, you know, circulate in global theaters of empire. And so Stuart's wonderful book has shown the way in which policing is tied into these global networks of counterinsurgency. And unsurprisingly, the same is true of the prisons. And so the second half of the book is really looking at that. And the overall theory, the overall sort of framework of the book, or, you know, the dominant driving analytic of the book is to think about war, is to think about prisons as a technology of domestic warfare, to take them out of a criminal justice analytic, which I argue obscures more than it reveals, and to show that prisons are a dynamic, flexible technology of counter-revolutionary warfare within US borders.
Thanks. So sticking on the rebellion for just a minute, you have a really original and incredibly insightful reading of what actually happened during those 4 days. And I think it goes again to what you were saying, that you really try to understand the politics on their own terms. And so one of the things you say is that we should understand the rebellion in Attica as abolition in practice. And you refer to the Attica commune. And you invoke a line from Marx writing about the Paris Commune, which was 100 years, almost exactly 100 years prior to the Attica Rebellion. So there's this line in Marx about the Paris Commune, where he says that the social measure of the commune was its own working existence. And so you kind of apply that lens to this 4-day explosion, in the sense of the explosion of possibilities, of forms of living and forms of being communal with one another inside the prison. So can you talk a little bit about this seeming paradox of this rebellion being abolition inside the prison, and why you call it the Attica commune?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't think this may not come to as a surprise to folks in the audience, but, you know, I think there's a way in which abolitionist theory circulates now where one could very easily think that abolition started in an academic classroom, like the concept, right? And so part of what the book does is to show how abolitionist theory and philosophy and praxis actually grew out of the on-the-ground organizing of incarcerated people who were engaged in a struggle in a very concrete way against their incarceration and against what they called genocide. But it's also true that at this moment, the 1970s that I'm looking at, abolition was just one term within a larger constellation of sort of visions of freedom, right? So there were abolitionists in Attica. There were people who were not abolitionists in Attica, but who understood themselves to be revolutionaries, third world Marxists, right? There were people who used decolonization as sort of the framework for their sort of liberatory practice. And so part of what I wanted to do was try to bring out some of those contradictions, but also to think about the unfolding of the Attica Rebellion, the actual formal period of September 9th to September 13th, as a praxis of abolition, right? Because part of the problem with the sort of dominant academic conception of abolition is that it gets thrown around as if it's just an identity, as if it's just something you can claim as an individual and use to sort of virtue signal, right? But what would it mean to think about abolition as a collective praxis, and where could we look for that collective practice? And I think that one of the key sort of paradigmatic sites of abolition is in fact in Attica itself, right? And as Stuart mentioned, this isn't without contradiction. And so, you know, one of the things I do in the book is talk a lot about political violence, which is something that the people who were engaged in this struggle deployed. And in fact, I don't even call it violence, I call it counter-violence, right? To acknowledge the fact that they're actually responding to a violence that was imposed upon them by the state. And so counter-violence and violence aren't equivalent, right? But they used this counter-violence to overthrow this repressive regime, right? And they created this space for breathing room where they were actually in control of a prison for a small amount of time. And during that time, they had lots of choices, right? They could have reenacted the violence that was enacted upon them onto the state. And this was a debate they had. They had a conversation about it. Let's do to them what they did to us. And they voted collectively to not do that and instead to do something else. And the something else that they did, I think, is really significant and something that we can learn from. And so what they did was they built a small commune, their own society, where they demonstrated to themselves and to the world that they were capable of meeting their own needs and creating a social system where resources were distributed, where problems were solved, where decisions were made in a much more democratic fashion than the way that we live outside this walls, outside the walls. And so the argument is that Attica is abolition. This rebellion is abolition, that this is a template, right? Or, you know, Joy James talks about the architects of abolition. So Attica would be a blueprint for abolition, right? But it wasn't without contradiction. So in the first place, it grew out of a prison itself, and it was geographically and temporally constrained, right? It wasn't a total abolition, right? It was just in this one small space for a small time. But also, within the rebellion, the Attica rebels created their own prison. And this is a contradiction that I talk about because, you know, academic abolition talks a lot about abolition as, you know, building a world without prisons, right? Which I'm not against. But the question for me became during Attica is, okay, so if we understand that what is unfolding is an actual war, and these people are engaged in a liberation struggle for their own freedom, what do you do with the antagonists of your movement that are immediately gonna pop up? What is the strategy for dealing with that, for managing counterinsurgent elements? And so I'm not suggesting that I have the answer for it, but what I tried to do was show and theorize how they, you know, dealt with this problem. And what they did was they came up with a people's prison where they incarcerated their enemies so that they could have the time to build their world. And I think often about someone named Dalu Gonzalez, who was in the Auburn Rebellion, the Attica Rebellion, and the Black Liberation Army, who said flat out in an interview, he said, you know, I'm not an abolitionist. What are we gonna do with the Rockefellers and the Nixons and shit? That was his quote. And I think that that's a real question that needs to be considered. And I don't think that ignoring it is doing us any favors.
So one of the other points along these lines about the kind of creativity of that very intense, extremely intense moment is that you point to is the internationalism of this revolt. Now, people who were involved in the revolt, as well as in the organizations that were playing a role, were many of them identified already as internationalists. But the idea that the revolt could end with some of these prisoners gaining freedom through free passage on an airplane to what they called a non-imperialist country, Algeria, Cuba, and others, you know, this was entertained as a serious possibility. And something else that, you know, hits really close to my own interest that you talk about in the book is that some of the demands of Attica were translated into other languages and circulated into prisons far away from upstate New York, including South Vietnam, where, you know, basically CIA advisors are overseeing these prisons in South Vietnam, and as you show, as maybe we'll get to in a moment, they're also involved in prisons in the United States. So can you talk a little bit? I mean, I think it's just incredibly fascinating and powerful politically to understand that there was this internationalism as part of this rebellion, and again, that, you know, it's not just this like a really narrowly bounded 4-day period of just inside those walls. That actually, what you show us is we should think of this rebellion in much broader scale.
Right, absolutely. You know, the people who were engaged in these rebellions, they were reading the great works of revolutionary warfare. You know, they were reading Mao, they were reading Che, they were reading you know, the Black Panther newspaper, which was profoundly international, as was Palante. So they were developing an internationalist philosophy and saw themselves as you know, part of the domestic, as part of a domestic front of a sort of a global third world movement. And they were recognized by other third world movements as being part of that struggle. And so one of the demands of the Attica brothers was transport, free and speedy transport out of confinement to a non-imperialist country. Right? Now this was written in their immediate demands. They wrote a set of immediate demands, and this lawyer from Buffalo came into the prison and saw that and said, you know, these are unrealistic. You know, write us some more realistic demands, which they did. And the dominant narrative of the Attica Rebellion sort of stops there. But what I show in the book is that first of all, the transport demand was not hegemonic. So there were 1,300 people in D Yard in Attica, and all of them, you know, didn't support that demand. From what I understand, something like a couple hundred did. But they voted to allow those couple of hundred to keep pursuing that demand. And so I really tried to open that up and see if anything else came from it. One of the things that's interesting is that members of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party came to Attica during the rebellion for the purpose of trying to coordinate that demand, right? And so part of the reason why people don't talk about it is because it seems kind of maybe ridiculous or outlandish today, but we have to think about the historical context of when this internationalist demand was asserted, okay? So, you know, I've written about the New York Panther 21, which was a group of Panthers in New York who were framed for attempting to, you know, bomb police stations all around New York, and they spent 2 years in jail, and eventually they were acquitted. many of the people who were in Attica were locked up with members of the Panther 21. Now, some of the members of the Panther 21, Sekou Odinga, who's still with us, he escaped capture and ended up, he and Larry Mack, both of them were both Panthers, they escaped capture by the police and wound up in Algeria, right? So, and there was, of course, an international section of the Black Panther Party in Algeria in 1971, and most of the people who were part of that international section were fugitives who had fled capture in the US and either made their way to Cuba or made their way to Algeria. So these people had friends and comrades who had done what they were trying to do. So it was a conceivable demand at that time, right? So Sophia Bukhari Alston, a member of the New York chapter and also a member of the BLA, writes in her book about how when she heard the demand, she got on the phone with foreign governments and secured permission from, I think, 4 different governments to take the Attica brothers. So at that point, it became a logistical question. How do we get a plane? How do we get the fuel? And that's what they were working on, but the massacre happened, right? The state crushed the rebellion before that could happen, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is to sort of narrate and theorize the audacity of their demands and to theorize like the ingenuity and courage of these people who were trying to realize these radical demands under intense repression and opposition. You know, after the rebellion, members of the, you know, people who were in solitary confinement received a letter of solidarity from contingents in Vietnam, in Cuba, saying, you know, we support your struggle and vice versa. So they were communicating through letters. So there was an intense internationalism. And the rebels had also developed an analysis of the domestic US prison as a way to stabilize US empire on the domestic front. And so they were saying, look, as we struggle against prisons in the US, we're struggling against Western imperialism. And as you struggle against Western imperialism, wherever you are in the third world, you're struggling against US prisons. So that was their analysis. They had developed an anti-imperialist analysis of prisons. And so everything they were doing was informed by this internationalism.
So as you said, the first half of the book is about revolution, and the second half is more about counter-revolution and repression. Obviously, they're deeply intertwined. So let's talk a little bit about the repression. And one of the, I mean, first of all, as we said, the repression is itself internationalist. It draws in many agencies of the national security state, and you know, at points, you know, like my own book, it ends up being like a series of acronyms, you know, or you know, initials, FBI, CIA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of that complexity and kind of impenetrability of even understanding who's doing what is part of the repression itself, because it's so hard to figure out who are the actors. So can you talk a little bit about first, just like, who are some of the agencies involved? I mean, we know that the state police obviously is involved in putting down the rebellion in Attica, the facility. So there's state police, there's FBI, there's CIA, there's other new initials that maybe, you know, nobody's ever seen until they've read your book, you know. So can you tell us a little bit about this complex kind of landscape of repressive agencies?
Sure. So again, you know, part of what the book is saying is that prisons are increasingly used as a strategy of political repression in roughly around 1970, right? Like with COINTELPRO, I mean, prisons have always been used as a strategy of repression, right? But I think this strategy intensifies and becomes more explicit and becomes employed through the sort of rubric of counterinsurgency with more force, roughly around 1967 to 1970. Historically, prisons are thought of to be rather inert, just receptacles where people are inserted and then like the idea is that you just forget about them, right? So I think the sort of state actors who were manipulating the courts in order to criminalize resistance had this misguided thought that, okay, if we just incarcerate these people, then we can get them off the street and we won't have to worry about them. And this actually backfired because you see an intensification of prison rebellion and they start to organize, and it turns out in the 70s, prisons were great places to organize because you have all of these disaffected people, some of whom have military experience, some of whom have been in gangs, and that's just, and they're under this intense repression. That's a great way, that's a great recipe for politicization, right? And so you see this intensification of prison rebellions, all right? And so the response, right, part of the response, right, what we know about, what most people know about in terms of Attica is the massacre, and we can talk about that, right? But the other part of the response, the more seductive and sinister and difficult to perceive aspect of the response was to invite new kinds of intellectuals, people that had PhDs in different fields, public administration, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, into the prison to reshape the prison, to reform the prison, to modernize the prison. And so, I mean, there's a ton of these folks in the book. So one thing I talk about is something that one of my mentors, Daruba bin Wahad, was the first to expose, right, which is the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, which was essentially, I mean, the best way to describe it is COINTELPRO within the prison, right? And so the FBI launched the counterintelligence program mostly to, you know, most of their activities were directed toward the Black Panther Party and disrupting the black movement. And part of what happened with COINTELPRO is it resulted in lots of frame-ups, right? But these people who were behind the walls, as I just said, continued to organize, and so they unleashed another layer of COINTELPRO inside the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, where they had a national symposium at the FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, where they brought prison administrators from all over the country and taught them tactics of guerrilla warfare, taught them tactics of counter-propaganda, and talked about explicitly how are we going to use this radicalization process that people are undergoing in prison to figure out how people like you get radicalized on the outside, because this is really what we want to know, right? So then it becomes not only about, okay, repressing prison organizing, let's use the prison as a laboratory to understand how to assert control over people who are not behind the walls. And this has always been the primary function of prisons, right? It's not necessarily just to incarcerate the people on the inside, it's to maintain order on the outside, and this became explicit. So the FBI, I didn't plan on it, but the research led me to CIA MK Ultra mind control experiments, which were happening in New York with assistance from psychiatrists who were coming across the border from Canada and elsewhere around the world. There was something called there's like Stuart said, there's so many. There was the New York State Identification and Intelligence System. This was essentially, at the time, it was the largest social science database ever created, and it was launched in the New York prison system in roughly 1965, and it was a way to bring together all the different criminal justice, the data from different criminal justice agencies in one place, and it explicitly used the same technology that was being used to power counterinsurgency programs in Thailand. And when you read the stuff, the documents, it's totally apolitical, right? It's all just about increasing efficiency, right? There's nothing sinister about it. But then when you look at some of the letters that these people wrote to each other, it's all about figuring out how to identify who's a radical and who's not, how to keep those people separate so that these different classes of people could be targeted for different kinds of repression. Yeah, so I mean, I could just keep going. It's just, it's a ton of agencies. I mean, and there's a way in which this can be read as a disempowering kind of like, oh, well, what's the point of struggling? But and people, you know, have asked me, well, how do you stay, you know, how do you, I mean, like, how did you do this? Like, how did you keep going? Because this seems so depressing. But I always read it as, damn, look at what they had to do to like, look at how far they had to go. Look at how effective our movements were, that they had to do all of that, right, to try to get these folks under control. So the problem I have is not so much the repression, it's the way in which these dominant, liberal, obfuscating criminal justice narratives prevent us from understanding that what is unfolding is war.
So this war takes some surprising forms. You know, I mentioned already that expansion of the prison is a reform. And part of it goes exactly to this point of separating out the supposedly non-political masses from the revolutionaries. So expansion, you talk about diversification of the prisoner population, and then you talk about various introduction of new types of programs in the prison. You use the term programification and humanization. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of these, what are we actually talking about when we talk about some of these reforms to the prison and how they fit into the, again, landscape of repression?
Yeah, so there's this narrative that prisons got better after Attica, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but the question is, what's the intent behind that, right? So my argument, as I've already said, is that prisons are an institutionalized form of counterinsurgency, all right? So, like, I would encourage you to read, like, Frank Kitson's book, Low Intensity Operations, which is all about counterinsurgency and was cited by the FBI as they developed COINTELPRO. Or you could read the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, which you can download for free, and just like do a word search for the word reform in the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, and it's like they use the word like 100 times, right? So let me back up a little bit. The first response to Attica was this massacre, which we can talk about, but it was this overwhelming public display of violence. I actually analyzed the massacre in a particular kind of way. Don't necessarily want to go there right now, right? And then there are all these reforms that happen. And there's a way in which the popular way in which Attica is narrated is to say that the reforms were distinct from the repression. But if you understand war, and specifically counter-revolutionary warfare or counterinsurgency, then you understand the centrality of reforms to repression. Why? Why is because counterinsurgents are trying to cleave the resistance movements. They're trying to fracture them into different parts. They're trying to isolate people who have revolutionary consciousness, revolutionary analysis, and an understanding of strategy and tactics. They're trying to separate those from the masses of people. And they're trying to induce the masses of people to pledge their allegiance or at least their obedience to the counterinsurgent regime. How do you do that? You do that by by ameliorating poor conditions and reforming conditions that will reduce the level of anger and discontent in a population. But doing it in such a way that does not require you to relinquish any of your power. Actually, to the contrary, it allows you to intensify your power because it pacifies resistance, right? So this is actually the function of prison reform historically, if we look at it from a counterinsurgent lens, right? So one of the things that happens after Attica is that prisons get better. Now we have to, I go through it in detail in the book, and I won't be able to sort of do it with the level of specificity that it demands. But I can say a couple of things. One, only certain prisons get better. And those are the prisons that you and I are most likely to see, right? So there's a game happening with perception in terms of what we're able to see and what we aren't able to see. Because at the same time that prisons are getting better for some, they're figuring out how to put revolutionaries in places where no one will ever see them again, right? And those two things need to be understood as two sides to the same coin. The reason why prisons are getting better for some historically is that they're trying to rob the movement of its of the source of what they think is the source of radicalization. Now, there's another layer to this, which is that these counterinsurgent folks don't even really understand how revolutionary politics works. They have a misreading of it, so they don't really get it. But that's another thing. Yeah, the other thing they do is they introduce all of these new prison programs, which, like prison education programs, for instance, and, I know people are into prison education. I'm not, it is what it is. I'm not, but people need to understand that there's a counterinsurgent history to this. Because the fact is that imprisoned revolutionaries already had their own prison education programs, right? So the introduction of university-sponsored prison education programs was in part a way to criminalize the informal study groups that were already happening, and to try to inculcate the population with more of a kind of a aspirational, a middle-class, bourgeois aspirational mentality that, okay, if I get my education, then I too can make it, right? So this is the history of this, right? And so a lot of people then ask me, well, does that mean prison education is good or bad? And to that, I would say, if we're talking about war, then there's a whole different kind of ethics involved. And good or bad in that simple way doesn't make sense in the same way. The same thing is like with the improving prison conditions. A lot of the revolutionaries, were ambivalent about that because they understood the extent to which, the axiom repression breeds resistance, right? They're trying to improve conditions to pacify rebellion. We're trying to foster rebellion. And so these are some of the tensions and contradictions that are unfolding. But yeah, it demands a more sophisticated understanding of repression beyond just the direct violence that's applied to the body, and thinking more about these more seductive, solicitous tactics that try to channel us out of rebellion into pathways that are ultimately going to stabilize the very systems that we're trying to challenge.
So I want to maybe ask one more question, which is kind of about where you started, because you mentioned doing a whole lot of interviews with revolutionaries, some of whom were in Attica, and others who were part of broader movements or in other facilities. So I'd love to hear. I know that you've shared the book with folks that you spoke to who helped you, make sense of what was going on, and I think you've really done an incredible job of honoring their revolutionary ideas and as you say, their political philosophy. And so I wonder, what has the reception been to the folks that you spoke to when you sent them the book?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I sent them the book, and I also sent them chapters of the book before it went to press. which was extremely nerve-wracking. Because I don't always agree with everything that they told me. So there's some parts of the book where like I disagree with them, or there's like some parts of the book where I critique people that I have profound respect for, but thought that that critique was necessary. And so there were some moments where, you know, I reached a conclusion that I thought people maybe wouldn't like, and so I printed out a copy of it. I wrote a letter and like sent it to him and was like, yo, read this and call me when you can. And, you know, and these folks are intellectuals, so they read the stuff and they got back to me, and everyone had been really supportive. And, you know, a lot of them had a particular kind of analysis, but then when they read all of the context, and, you know, some of them didn't know everything else that was maybe going on. And so they're like, oh, damn, like I hadn't thought about it like that. You've forced me to think about this in a different kind of way. So a lot of that, which is, you know, that's just been an honor to be able to do that. You know, a lot of my method would be, you know, typically the way it works in sort of academic historiography is that the state archive gets prioritized in terms of what can be said and cited, and then people might throw an interview on top of it or next to it to sort of flesh it out. But I sort of turned that on its head, and I started with what revolutionaries were saying, and then I would say, okay, let me see to what extent I can corroborate this, you know? And so I would go out and try to find evidence, and then I would bring it back to them and say, look, this is what I found. What do you think about this? And we'd have another conversation. So they knew how things were unfolding as it unfolded. So it's been an honor to be entrusted with those stories. And, you know, I try to stay in contact with folks. So let's see. Daruba has told me that he likes the book. Jalil Muntakim said that he likes it. And other brothers are still working on it. You know, they're taking their time and they're reading it. So I'll check in on them soon. But, you know, I guess what I'm just trying to say is I'm just extremely grateful for the long-term relationships that I've been able to build with folks. And, you know, my highest aspiration is that they'll read this and feel like I, you know, treated their knowledge with the care that it deserves. And then one other thing I just want to acknowledge, you know, Eddie Ellis, who was the first person I interviewed, who passed away in 2014, like shortly after one of our interviews. Larry White, who makes several appearances in the book, passed away. James Blood McCreary, I interviewed him. He also passed away. Yeah, so a lot of them, you know, weren't able to actually see the book or hold the book in their hands, but, you know, now they're among us as ancestors. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you. Want to do questions?
All right, so we definitely have some time for Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll come with a mic to you.
Do I have to say my name and stuff? Do I have to introduce myself? Okay. Hi, my name is Erica. I represent the Black Alliance for Peace, so we're here as a collective tonight.
Right on.
But I admittedly have not read the book, but I have heard a few of your interviews. But I think this is the first time that I heard you reference internationalism in that way. Because I have a few criticisms about abolition, particularly because of the way that it sort of is detached from internationalism. So the idea of all states are bad and all of that is kind of expressed through abolition here. So I just wanted to maybe, I guess, prose a little bit more about how do you see abolition and internationalism as interconnected or interweaved, or how could we start to see that in this sort of current iteration of it?
Yeah,
That's it.
thank you so much. You know, as I was writing the book, or when we were thinking about like how to market the book, my editor was very big on, you know, positioning the book as an abolitionist book. Like this is, you know, this is gonna, you know, and I told her, I was like, you know, I don't talk about abolition a whole lot in the book, you know. I think that, so there's that, you know. I don't talk about abolition a whole lot. I don't necessarily theorize it a lot. What I try to do is show it, show how it unfolded in the practices that the people who were at the front of the struggle engaged in, like, you know, what, you know, because, and like I said earlier, you know, that term was circulating alongside a whole lot of other sort of frameworks for thinking about liberation. So I don't think the people in the book are necessarily tied to abolition, nor am I, and that's not necessarily a critique, but it's just like, you know, yeah, so I wanted to say that. The question of internationalism, yeah, so the section in the book on that topic, I title it Abolitionist Internationalism. And part of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about abolition in the book is the abolition of a particular kind of subject, a particular kind of person that was created through the violence of the state. A subject that was created by the violence of the state and for the state's use, right? So like a docile subject, a subject that could be contained. And so part of what the rebellion was about like the creation of a different kind of being. So it's also, and part of why I talk about it in that way is because that's how the people that I talk about it. They talk about how they became something different through the process of engaging in the struggle. And so all of these things are sort of contradictory and they're unfolding through praxis. So, you know, I don't necessarily have a answer for you in terms of what is my view on abolition vis-a-vis the state. And I don't think the book offers an answer for that. Yeah, I guess that's my answer. My answer is I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Great question over here.
Thanks. So you mentioned early on that you had some interesting methodological interventions here, right? And that a lot of histories sort of center state archives more than they should, right? Especially if they're trying to create a critical history. Can you talk about some of your strategies beyond consulting state archives and the interviews with the participants in order to expand your archival sort of milieu?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is about just building deep and accountable relationships of trust and talking to people multiple times over the course of years. At which point, you know, so like some of the best stuff I found was very carefully stored in the bedroom of one of my interlocutors who had saved some amazing material for 50 years. And we developed a relationship such that, you know, he allowed me to go through this very intimate collection of documents in his bedroom, many of which were produced by the state. Like they were official documents, but like they're not archived anywhere else. They had been destroyed or just hadn't been saved. So that's part of it. So thinking about like personal collections and personal archives. Part of it is talking about documents, right? So there's this one part in the book where, so I found a letter that this incarcerated revolutionary wrote to his son. So I found that letter, and then I brought the person, Larry White, who's now passed away, I brought him and his son together, and we read the letter together. And in the process of reading the letter together, the three of us, a different meaning of the letter appeared for me. I thought it was just a letter about a father expressing his love to his son, which it is, but there's also a deeper level of meaning there where it's actually a letter about the nature of rebellion, and it's about knowledge and a whole bunch of other things. And the meaning of that came out through the process not only of finding the document and interpreting it on its own terms, but creating meaning in a community of the three of us, talking about it together. So I not only write about the content of the letter in the book, but the process of creating that knowledge collectively, so stuff like that. And then the other thing is like, so it's not, you know, archival research isn't rocket science, but you have to develop a particular way of reading these documents. And part of how you read the documents is through war, because I think those documents, a lot of the ways that they're narrated and archived is with a kind of, let's call it a white supremacist epistemology that tries to criminalize different kinds of knowledge, right? What the FBI was doing was just collecting all of our material, all of our documents, all of our theory, but for the purpose, again, of criminalizing them and putting them in their files as attachments and all these things. So I would go looking for FBI files, but my goal would be not to read what the FBI is saying, but to find the attachment that they're saying it about, take the attachment out, and then try to read it on its own terms and reassemble it back and to reinsert it back into the sort of the historical and political context in which it was written, and take it out of the FBI sort of criminalizing knowledge, right? So it's less about, you know, new methods and more about a particular way of interpreting knowledge and a particular way of sort of looking for it.
Other questions? I have some from the stream. So one person wanted to know, thinking about all the ways that the state responded to incarcerated revolutionaries, were there examples that you found of the state using illness and attacking their health as a kind of intentional tactic? And another question, a little more open-ended, which is, what question did you not get a chance to explore that you're working on in the future?
Yeah, illness. Well, yeah, there was a lot of weird stuff happening in the Dannemora State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which was a prison mental institution where the MK Ultra experiments were happening, among other kinds of experiments. So I haven't uncovered any new information about that necessarily, but like some of the people who were involved in that, what's the guy's name? Of course I'll forget his name, but William Sweet. Yeah, William Sweet. He's on record as having, you know, radiated incarcerated people with like cancer-causing radiation and stuff like that. I mean, so that kind of stuff was happening. I haven't specifically encountered anything like that. Most of what I found was people getting electroshock treatment, people being exposed to all kinds of drugs, drugging their food, drugging their water, sensory deprivation, that kind of stuff. But the individuals who were carrying these practices out were the kinds of folks who were empowered to move across borders and in and out of different institutions, and were doing all kind of stuff. They basically had a green light to do all kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm sure they were, trying to induce illness. I told one brother who hadn't been experimented on about the experiments, and he talked about how, he told me, this isn't in the book, but he told me about how when he got out, he had something going on with his bladder and just was constantly urinating. And he thought that that had something to do with something they had given him. In terms of what I'm working on now, I'm trying to write a little bit more about methods and how I did what I did. And there's just lots of stories and things that I couldn't fit in the book that I'm trying to figure out how to make a home for. So that's sort of what I'm working on. And then there's, I'm trying to get this biography of Dhoruba bin Wahad off the ground. And really what I need for that is just time, just time. So we're working on that and some other projects, a book of his writings and philosophy as well, which I think would be useful for a lot of people.
Any other questions? All right. I'm not going to call on anybody, but I want to thank Orisanmi. Thank you for this book. It is a gift and a real contribution to many, many fields of not just study, but of revolutionary action. And Stuart, thank you for your excellent questions. And thank you all for coming. And please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
Also, the book is for sale, so you should grab a copy and get it signed, because when this book is huge in a couple of months, you can say that you were there first.